Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome back to another episode. Dr. Valerie, it's a pleasure to see you. You're looking chipper. You're looking happy. You got the nice, beautiful, I don't know if that's a shirt or what they would call a blouse, but it's awesome. I like it.
Thank you. I think it's what they call a jacket because it has no buttons. But I actually got it because it made me smile. So thank you.
Because flowers. And I'm just connecting the dots here, but your cat's named Penelope, and they might have some ancient roots to it. But at the same time, I'm just assuming like a flower, Penelope. I think one of her favorite flowers was one of these orchid type things, if I'm not mistaken.
Gosh, I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up. The flowers are not ancient. Well, I mean, they're ancient in the sense that I'm ancient. I grew up in Hawaii, so for me, wearing flowers and things that look like this is sort of a pretty normal thing and not just something people do in the summer or on vacation. So it reminded me of something I'd wear at home, and I haven't actually worn it in Hawaii. I haven't been back there for a long time, but yes, my kitty's name is Penelope, and she is sitting here beside me, but she's a little bit shy, so I don't think she's going to come on the video.
That's okay. Well, at least I got you. That's better. That's better. I like just having you. It's me and you talking here. I had a couple questions. You have, well, first of all, let me ask you, what has been on your mind of recently?
Well, recently I've been thinking a lot about the student debt cancellation because, of course, that's in the news. And it affects me as a person with considerable student debt. And I've got a lot of opinions about that, some of which do have ancient roots, I think. Um, but that's,
What do you mean some have ancient roots? What do you mean some have ancient roots?
well, the whole question of, economics, I think it's one of the main conceits of the modern age. So something we lie to ourselves about, that economics is sort of a uniquely modern thing, right? It's this supposed to be scientific, it's supposed to be something that you can't argue with. Oh, if we do this with the economy, then the outcome will necessarily be that. Um, and I think, at least in pop culture, a lot of people have an idea that in medieval times and ancient times, they really had no notion of economy. It well, like economic theory, like if uh, the plebs were unhappy, then the emperor would just, fix the price of wine, and that would solve the problem. And of course, now we know better, right? We can't have price fixing. Um, but really, all of that's kind of nonsense. Um, of course, ancient and medieval people didn't have our notions of, supply side economics or what it means if you fixed a price, but they all experienced the economy in the sense that they participated in the exchange of money for goods and services, and they did have, ideas about what that meant for society. And one of the things that I think you could say we've lost sight of in the modern world, that the at least the medieval world, I think, knew quite clearly, and something that's been preserved in the tradition of Islamic banking, which obviously goes back to Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, and has turned into its own sort of science called fiqh in Arabic, I believe, um, is this idea that debt as a thing is necessarily uh, socially difficult. So in Islamic banking, I don't know if you've ever been in a place where you've seen XYZ Islamic Bank. They're fairly common. I mean, obviously in the Middle East, but also in the UK, where I spent some time. And you'd probably wonder, just looking at the sign, okay, what is Islamic banking? And it's a little bit complicated, but basically, like, the basic reason behind it is, in Islam, there is an idea that it is, you're not really allowed. I mean, this might differ between schools of Islam, and I really shouldn't talk about things I don't know that much about. But as far as I understand, the general basic idea is that Muslims are not allowed to lend money and profit off of interest, right? So Islamic banking is a when you bank in an Islamic bank as a religious Muslim, you're being told, okay, these are these investments that you can make, or if you put your money in the bank, um, none of the profit that you might make from it, or none of the profit that we, the bank, might make from it, will come from anything that's not allowed by our religion, right? So we won't lend money out at interest. Um, this was also something that was largely forbidden to Christians in the Middle Ages. So, of course, this leads down the road of the Jews being bankers and all of the different things connected with that. And you can pretty quickly go down a sort of conspiracy theory road if you want. And that's not really what I want to do. What I want to do is just to emphasize that in both Islamic and indeed sort of Christendom, so Islamic lands and Christian lands in the Middle Ages, there was this idea that people shouldn't generally profit off of something uh, like the interest on a loan, so something that wasn't productive. And more than that, there was also this idea of the Jubilee year, and these were proclaimed, if I remember rightly, by popes, and they would come in regular cycles in the religious calendar in the Christian West, and in a Jubilee year, all debts would be forgiven. So there would be like a cycle where people who needed to uh, borrow money or something in order to sustain their lives, usually people like serfs, for example, right? Because sometimes serfs would need to borrow money in order to pay the lord. For example, the crops failed or weren't as good as they were projected to be, right? That could either ruin you, or you could take a loan. And so there was this idea that every 20 years or so, all outstanding debts, so debts that hadn't been repaid, would be wiped away from the ledger, and everybody would start fresh. And this was an accepted idea. And I bet you can see why this was something that was culturally accepted at the time, and why this was something that was considered economically good.
What I love about this show is I never know where it's going to go. That's the best part about it. But this is fascinating to me because I was going to ask you the question, do you think that historical record sets place or sets the track for the way society thinks and the way society acts? And I've only been obsessed with the historical record as of recent, just with the JFK topic and some other ones that I've went in there. I have a strong fascination not only with Greek mythology but also the Industrial Revolution. But when I started reaching out to guests to talk about Industrial Revolution, the Great Depression, a lot of these historians are historians, but not in the sense of being a historian. They're historians in the sense of talking about the economic factors of what causes these events to happen. And I start wondering, where in the historical record did we start to see the influence of economics where it took over the track of history? I mean, we know throughout history there are events you could probably say that this person did this certain act or certain thing because of what, and then you could name off a bunch of different things. You can name off, oh, they did it, they went to war with this because a skirmish, or they went to war because of this, because that person had this resource that this person wanted and it was a sign of greed. But there's always been this underlying factor that links in with commerce, which is why the decisions that have been made throughout history have been made for that sense. Someone doing a task only because they are in debt to someone who is telling them to go do this task. Would that person even accomplish those challenges? Would Hercules even have done the 12 trials or done the trials if he didn't have some type of purpose or meaning at the end when he completed all of them? Like there's these underlying factors where I start wondering, you know, how big of an influence is just not only commerce, but just the factor of the way that our historical record. I have huge issues with our historical record, not just the American historical record, everybody's historical record. I don't believe a single freaking thing from it. I mean, I like some of the myths and some of the legends, and it might be controversial to say I don't believe anything in it. I just think that there's underlying influences that we end up finding out later. Like, for instance, there's theories and it's more conspiratorial, but some people bring up the example of why we were in Vietnam. Now, there's many of reasons to be involved in Vietnam, but one of two of the longest wars we've ever had have been Vietnam and Afghanistan. And one thing that they do share a similarity with is it's one of the largest heroin places in the world, like the Golden Crescent or whatever it's called. So that conspiracy doesn't seem that nuts to me. I mean, there's just a lot of factors where we look at an overall objective of why we do something at the prize that maybe our eyes are too big for our stomachs. So, I mean, that's just interesting. I don't know. Maybe that took us down a weird route, but I mean,
No, I don't think it's weird at all. I think it makes a lot of sense. One thing I can say, just as a comment, is my husband has a friend who went into the army after college. So we're elder millennials. So that was first Iraq and then Afghanistan. And his friend just told him, look, if you see anything about we're in Afghanistan protecting the poppy fields and the drug trade, it's not wrong. And he didn't go into further detail about that, but that's always kind of stuck with me as a thing that my husband heard from somebody who was there for a long time. And I think I think that a lot of the more unsavory motives that are uncovered over time, like when it comes to something like Vietnam or Afghanistan or Iraq or, who knows, in the future, Syria, Yemen, um, are are like that. You know, most wars are not actually fought over freedom. Some genuinely are, most are not. And people uh, the people who run our governments, they know that ordinary people just want a story. So they create stories to tell all of us. That's what media is. And sometimes these stories have a relationship to the truth, and sometimes they really don't. I mean, you were saying you have issues with the historical record, and I think everybody should, because like Napoleon said, history is a story written by the winners.
well, when did the greed take place? Do we have to trace it back? Is there an ancestral record of, an emperor or a king jacking up a price on something all because he wanted to get his own profits? I mean, we knew that wars were waged over salt. I mean, that's the story I heard. I heard also the fact that salt was this thing to preserve your meats. It had a lot of valuable assets to it, which is why people wanted it so bad. But I mean, at the same time, who was the person that popularized this idea of using salt? Would that person be responsible for the wars that were waged across that? I mean, it just gets me into this area where I start wondering, like, why do we like? Because I think today is not much different from. I mean, the technology is different, sure, but in a lot of way, a lot of these things that we do are old. They're solidified in stone, and these ideas of religion, these ideas of these things. I like them all. I just think that they have some types of stories that get told and the message originally gets lost. And I start looking at like who created this message, like who created the story of these gods, these Greek mythology that or Roman mythology, these differences where there are similarities in both of those lore. But at the same time, they have different aspects of it that are changed and modified to fit what a different audience, a different group that agrees with the same boundaries, but at the same time just doesn't like the names of certain gods or doesn't believe that their power is maybe a full scope of what the other one believes. Maybe it's a more minuscule or more abstract. Like I've heard so many stories from different gods that are like, this god had a kid over here and this god is that. And then you look in the other religion or you look in the Roman side of it, and it's like, oh, that never happened. Actually, he did with this one, and then he did this trial and did this tribulation. Where I start going, you guys have the same notes to your stories, but at the same time, there are just large differences that don't seem that large until you look later down the timeline.
Well, one of the things that I think we should remember when we're looking at mythology is that the culture and the mindset that created or gave rise to these myths was not our own. So our modern mindset is always looking for the story, right? We're always looking for um, the origin of something or the real facts or the real story, and we want to try to sift through all these different stories and come up with, the distilled, genuine article. But from everything that I've read and researched about mythology, the ancient sort of Greek and Roman mindset about these stories was very different. They weren't really very troubled by the fact that different polis or different city states or different groups of people would have variations on different myths. So if someone said, well, actually Hercules did 13 labors, not 12, which I don't think there's a record of that. But let's just say that there were a group of people somewhere in northern Greece that said that. I don't think that would have caused like the ancient Athenians that much grief. They would have thought, well, we're talking about the gods and the offspring of gods. They can do anything. Um, it's not really about what the one story is. And when you see a lot of these variations in myths, like you're talking about, a lot of them have to do with the location of the community that told the stories. So a lot of times you'll see myths sort of being reshaped to have a local relevance or relevance to a particular group of people or royal family, because people want to work themselves into these stories to solidify, their own identity and their own power. um, so, for example, Julius Caesar made a point of claiming divine heritage, right? Ultimately from Venus. And at a certain point, it sort of became a joke. A Roman emperor would die and then almost automatically be declared a god, right? Because Augustus sort of set that trend. And for example, when the Emperor Claudius died, who is my favorite emperor for what it matters,
Why is he your favorite?
he is my favorite emperor because he was the philologist emperor. So, and also on a more personal note, um, he was born premature. I was born premature. He was born disabled. I was born disabled. And in ancient Rome, in that culture, most disabled baby, like obviously disabled babies or premature babies, would have probably not been given all the advantages that Emperor Claudius was given. It's not true that they were always exposed at birth, left to die. That's a pretty common view, but there is some archaeological evidence now that it's not really what happened. People did grow up with at least certain kinds of disabilities. But he was special in that he was born into the imperial family, right? So they were probably kind of embarrassed of him. He had an uncontrollable twitch. He stuttered. Um, he walked with a limp because one of his legs was shorter than the other. But he was very intelligent, and he had a lot of theories about the Etruscan language, at least maybe. I'm kind of basing this a lot off of Robert Graves' I Claudius and Claudius the God. Graves was Robert Graves. Robert Graves was a poet mainly, a First World War poet. He was all set up to become like a classics professor. He had, I think, his grandfather back in Germany was a famous classicist, and that's the way his education pointed him. But he was so afraid of taking up his classic scholarship at St. John's College in Oxford, which is one of the most important and hardest to get classic scholarships for undergraduates in Oxford even today. That he decided to sign up to go to war instead. And after the war, he survived, and he went back to Oxford because the university made all kinds of exceptions for people who'd gone to war instead of going to university. And so he went back to Oxford, and he begs to be able to study English instead of classics. And he did English literature instead, but it didn't really matter. I mean, he had a classical background, and he had, in some ways, at least as much of a background in classics, um, even without doing the undergraduate degree that a lot of us do today. He became a writer. He lived on the island of Majorca, where he died and is buried. He was a little bit of an eccentric and a mystic, and he believed that he kind of had a connection to the Emperor Claudius. And so some people say, well, he made up all of these things in his books because it's historical fiction. Um, and in a way, okay, he's a writer, it's a book. Somehow it came out of his head. But he believed that he was communicating a story that hadn't been recorded before, that he wasn't just creating it, that he was somehow communicating with the Emperor Claudius. And there's no rational reason to believe that, but when I read these books, I thought that was true. Because I don't know, you've probably read a fair amount of historical fiction. I know I have. And there's really good historical fiction where you can put it down, you can say, yeah, I can see this happening, or these motivations of these characters make sense. And then there's historical fiction that's just really kind of copy pasted onto some sort of famous event, and you think, yeah, this is not believable at all. um but when I read Graves's work, I thought, not only is this believable, it really has the ring of truth. So anyway.
Well, I think it's good to speculate in that regard if it's to get somebody interested into the topic. But we have a large issue in our society right now where there's a lot of people that can't define what is real historical record and what's just someone adding stuff to make a narrative fit, for instance. I mean, I'd be a hypocrite if I said I didn't do that. I definitely do. I mean, I don't try and manipulate stuff, but I get things wrong. But what I hear is off of somebody else's account of things, and they might add in something to get a book to sell. And then it's hard to find the historical record. Like, how many people would be happy with we talk about history creating stories. There's the official record that everyone wants to know what really happened. It's probably not going to be as exciting as what our history books might teach us or what our history books might say about something. They're doing the same exact thing that an author can do. But there's weird lines where we accept what's in the history book as fact and what is an author's interpretation as just like a work of fiction or a work of this. And it's just like, I mean, our history books add details all the time to things that don't happen. Then you learn the real account of things from documents. Like I've looked through government documents over and over again to try and understand the Cold War a little bit more. And it's just a completely different story that's not being taught because obviously history is written by the winner, which really makes it like weirder when you look back at ancient history. The fact that there were such few people writing tablets down, or not even just such few people, there was probably a good amount of people writing things down, but who's got accepted? Who's got to be the one that was preserved and passed down and told as a legacy or a history? For instance, Homer. Everybody mentions this freaking Iliad thing. You've mentioned it more than once. And it's just like this thing where I brought it up to my buddy Steve in a podcast. I was like, how important is this thing to the historical record? And he goes, well, it is pretty important when it comes to the factor of like, that's where a lot of like base conclusions and a lot of base knowledge about these certain situations. It was just this perspective that everyone kind of goes by. And then you start realizing there were people that were copying Homer's writings, that obviously people with higher education that study this specifically could tell that this wasn't exactly Homer. It was kind of like a spinoff or some type of writer that was copying his works. But if you can't decipher what that is at the time it's being consumed, then you have people believing that this is the work of the original Homer. And then now you have a lot of people going off of it like it's fact, even though it might just be added and manipulated in a way to fit their perspective rather than the original perspective that everybody buys. So whenever I hear information, I just go, okay, I'm going to set it back here. And then I hear somebody else's story and I set it back here. I don't make any conclusions on anything. Everything to me is a smoking gun and I ain't jumping on it.
Well, that's totally fair, and you're absolutely right to say that as time went on, there were poets that wrote in the style of Homer, very consciously, in fact. But this brings us back to a question of mindset, and what I'll say again is, in the ancient world, there really wasn't this idea that, we should only look for the most original form of something. I mean, obviously the Iliad and the Odyssey were associated with Homer from very early on, but that didn't mean that later audiences in the ancient world wouldn't have, happily uh, read or listened to uh, what we would call sort of pseudo Homer, right? People writing in the style of Homer, people continuing the stories from the Iliad and the Odyssey, and there's evidence of a lot of this going on. Not, I mean, we do have some of it uh, uh, in the epic cycle. That there are later poems that
But
tell us more of the story.
would more people look at the book that Plato wrote compared to the person that if it was Plato's work just handed to a younger child and the child decided to put his name onto it, would people accept the same amount of information that was given from that book? Would people give it a chance? Like I believe that if you had the Bible and you just put a different cover on it and called it something else, you maybe added and mixed around a couple of words, but it had the same overall message in it, and it was made by, if it was made by someone in today's time period, you might have some people that would be curious and pick it up and read it, but you wouldn't have the overall acceptance that the overall Bible does in religious practices today. There's like these weird slip-ins, what we choose to divide as information and what we choose to divide as conspiracy. Like I have a huge issue with that right now, where it's like I'm looking through history and like trying to find out what's historically real compared to what we've just historically accepted, because it's easier to accept it than look at the real possibilities of something. It makes everything a little bit more confusing, which makes me want to be a historian, because I'm just like, damn it, I want to go through this record and figure out what the truth is.
Well, what you're doing right now is called historiography, which is an incredibly important subfield of history. So that means, you're looking at the stories that have been recorded, and you're trying to see how all these different parts of the puzzle fit together or don't. Um, you're right to say that you're troubled by this dichotomy that we've got in our culture today, where there's the accepted history, and then there's conspiracy theory. And I know you're working on a movie about JFK and his assassination, and if memory serves, the phrase conspiracy theory was specifically coined um, to label people who didn't accept the official conclusions of the Warren
Where
Commission,
did you hear
right?
that from?
My dad.
Damn, all right. Because I've said that on my show a couple of times. The form is called 1035 960. It's which is interesting. If you look up 1035 960, you're gonna get that report. But if you did what I did and you've been saying 1095 instead of 1035, you're gonna get a different report. And it's still by the CIA, but the document is completely different. What the document for 1095 is, it's a 6-page paper on the human brain and ways to manipulate the consciousness, where I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? Like you just start learning and interesting things about, like I get it. Like I think there's many perspectives throughout history we're just not going to be able to understand. It might end up coming out later. And I don't mind speculation. Speculation is definitely fine on my show. I do it all the time. But when we talk about like history, I could say certain motives could be drawn to this conclusion because of obviously how this person's track record is. But then you look at like history, how do you do that with history? I mean, you look at like Steve brought this up to me. It was kind of an issue he was having with his Spartan podcast. There's a lot of people in history that want to say, I'm going to make sure Achilles, was he homosexual? And a lot of push in that community, people are saying he is. And I think a lot of that does stem from the movie Troy, where you see this working relationship. But what you also have to take into account is the guy also dressed up as Achilles, his best friend, and went to battle and was killed. So his overreaction of this guy's death, was it a guilt trip or was it a love? And that's when you have to look at that. I mean, I think with history, there's just a lot of like looking back and trying to add something based on today's times as well, too. And I think we need to factor that in on a lot of things. I mean, I don't think the historical record, like I obviously there was people with disabilities back then, but how many people were maybe added later on through history, like, oh, this person actually had a disability, just because it fits today's time and makes more people interested in it. That's fine if you want to get people interested in the topic. But then I'm just like, but what's the historical right to it? Like, I want to know like what exactly who this person is. Because then you would end up admiring someone like George Washington and you find out his teeth weren't made of cherry wood, they were made of slave teeth. It's a little lie, but it freaked people out. And that's like that's the hardest thing right now is there's a large area of like mistrust with education in general. I think it's important. I think it's obviously I try and talk to as many people as I can and get their perspectives. But like I said, history, I think it's really important. I wouldn't have considered it important 10 years ago, but I consider it important now. But trying to understand what is it and is it manipulated by something? I think the changes in history's winds, I would say, have always been manipulated, and there's no real historical record that we have. I think we're always learning or uncovering something new. And I bet you there's always something that's going to dismiss that 10 years later. But it seems like history at this point is about accepting the one that we all want to accept rather than the truth behind what the actual history is. Like it's hard to think that, people are okay with accepting Christopher Columbus was a bad guy. But then you look at like the historical time period, how many people were doing the same exact thing, but that never gets brought up. You know what I mean? Like there's just this overall acceptance of like one person can be the faulter, but not everyone. And I'm like, I think it's an overall human value that we all find these trends and we all are probably susceptible to being pieces of trash at times. And I think we have to accept that with history, but you can't look at it from the lens that we have today.
I agree with that. I think that
It's an
there
unpopular
is,
opinion, I could tell you that.
well, yeah, I think it's unpopular because there's something in people and human nature that wants to know what the story is, and depending on the topic and the story, and how close we feel we are to it culturally, personally, whatever, if you can identify with something, then it kind of becomes part of you. And then if someone tells you, hey, actually, the real story is a lot more disturbing, or this person did things that you're probably not going to like, people are going to treat it in a way as sort of a personal attack, right? Because now it's something they identify with themselves. So that is something that I think you can see on social media every day. And not just with history either, with anything, like with the canon of, you know, like, Marvel comics or the Lord of the Rings or just anything like that, that any story that people really identify with. But
Are you a
in
Lord of the Rings?
terms of hmm?
I was gonna say, are you a Lord of the Rings fan?
I am a fan. I'm not like a super fan, so I haven't read the Silmarillion and I don't know all of the trivia.
I just want to know
But
how old that book is. Apparently, it was older than any of the movies that we've had. Like it's an old book.
yes, it's an old book. I believe it was published. I don't know the exact date, but it was published in the 60s. And my parents being sort of well, they were not the oldest baby boomers, so they were kind of mid-range baby boomers. They graduated from Berkeley High School in 1970, and they I remember I saw a clip in a documentary or something about Tolkien, and Tolkien was saying to a reporter that his phone number had been in the Oxford phone book because it's normal, right? You have a phone, you put the number in the phone book so people you know can call you. Well, Tolkien was getting these calls from Americans who were high and didn't like realize that there was a time difference between Britain and America. And they were asking him all these sorts of really weird questions about the Lord of the Rings, and he said, "Well, I've had to take my number out of the phone book, and it's terribly inconvenient." He kind of growled, and he really didn't appreciate that at all. So that to me is really funny intersection of several things, telephones, international calling, drugs, the Lord of the Rings, the 60s, this all came together, just kind of exploded.
I think that's interesting to me because like it still sticks along what we're talking about, which is what resonates with people. How come it resonates with a bunch of stoners, the Lord of the Rings? You know what I mean? Like it created, I mean, Lord of the Rings, I think you can ask anybody that question, you know what Lord of the Rings is. People will tell you they know what it is. Whether they've seen it or not, it's a different question. But that's the thing that influenced society. And it was just a book that was written by a guy from another country who just wanted to write down something in his, in his mind, a fantasy story, whatever you want to say. And it's influenced popular culture. Like I always brought up the question, do you think movies influence society or do you think society influences movies? I think it's kind of both ways. But I think we're in a weird time where like I think more people are having first interactions with movies compared to actual historical record on things. And
Oh,
I think it causes them to get interested into it, but I just want to make sure that it's not causing them to get interested into it for the wrong reason. You know what I mean? Like it's good to see Clash of the Titans. That's one of my things that got me super interested in Greek mythology. Now, do I know the real story? Yes. Is it anything like the movie? Somewhat, sure. I mean, the names are the same, but you get into this aspect. It's not. The story's different. It's a little bit deeper. It's a little bit more, I would say, bland if you're not like a or if you're looking at it from a fan of the movies. But I enjoyed it. It got my interest in it. But then I know the truth of it. So now then when I watch one of those movies, I can point out the BS. And it's like the same thing we have when a lot of movies. There's a lot of movies that get people interested in things, but when they go into it or they decide this is something that they're interested in, they want to learn more about it. Do they accept it, or do they just kind of go, oh, I rather just prefer the movie? More people like the Harry Potter books and don't like to watch the movies. More people like to read the Lord of the Rings books rather than watch the movies. And we're just in this time period now where everything's switching over to the digital age, where we look at people, if a movie comes out about Julius Caesar, is it going to be the movie that's set right with the historical record? Or is it going to be something like when they recreated Romeo and Juliet and they did it in a newer age thing with guns and everything like that? It was awful because I knew what Romeo and Juliet was. It was nothing like this. I think it was interesting, but it wasn't, the best thing. But how many people are going to see that movie and then go and read the story and not be appreciative of what the story actually is? So now we have the new movies influencing the historical record and now devaluing the historical record.
well, you're bringing up a lot of issues there, and gosh, let's see
I'm trying my
where
best. I'm just kidding.
where should I start? Um, as far as I remember with Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, he got really tired of grading essays from students one week because in the Oxford system you meet with your tutor once a week and you have to prepare an essay, right? And so it depends on your tutor's approach. Sometimes you read them aloud um, for your tutorial group, and then everybody talks about what you wrote. And sometimes there isn't time for that, or your tutor doesn't like to do that. So you kind of summarize what you wrote and you have a discussion, and then you give your tutor your essay, and he reads it later on. And from what I remember, there was an interview with Tolkien, and he said, "Well, I just got so tired of reading these essays from students that I turned one over and I started writing, the very beginning of The Hobbit." And in a way, you know, when that series came out, I think people were really hungry for something all absorbing, something that was ancient, something that wasn't new, right? Because after World War II and in the 50s, everybody was thinking, okay, what's new? We want to go beyond the culture that took us into World War II. We want to um go down a completely new path. But in in the 60s, there was a lot of rebellion. I don't even know, because I've read recently, and this is going around the internet, so maybe you have too, but it looks like the cultural trends in the 50s and the 60s, especially modernism, Dadaism, a lot of this sort of nihilism in art and architecture, was basically planted there by the CIA. So I think when you get to
I'm sorry. That's
the
hitting
modern day,
the
um,
bone for me.
yeah, I think when you get to the modern day, because what we're talking about in terms of the difference between myth and historical record, was Achilles gay? Was Patroclus his friend or his boyfriend? Um, the only thing I could say about that is that there are fragments in ancient Greek that are pretty evocative, right? So the question is then, is that Iliad fan fiction? So is that something somebody wrote later in the style of Homer as something entertaining for people to listen to or to read? Or was that generally accepted as part of the story of Achilles and Patroclus? And I don't think that we will be able to tease that out, right?
Well, back to what we said in the beginning about the influence of commerce and the influence of economics into history. What happens if we just switch the currency and switch it from actual trade goods and money? Um, Debt aside today, the issue of debt, student debt today, take that aside with how valuable money is still today. I think it's valuable. I think it's devalued in a lot of aspects. I think it's a weird, because you see this timeline of when trade goods were more valuable than gold or all this other types of stuff. It was more about trying to survive. Then you see this shift in this period where money is now the most accepted form of currency, but also in today's time we're having this reversal of switching back to commerce goods. NFTs were a good example of a first starter in that realm. But I think the currency has switched, and I think the currency now is accepted through the way that we use propaganda. Propaganda is a word that I'm starting to have a different kind of connotation of what that actually means. For instance, the Cold War. I looked into the Cold War. I can tell you how exhausting it is looking at all the pamphlets that were flying around back then, that were just posted everywhere, that were media sources that were pushing this nuclear war, buy a bomb shelter. They use that for marketing purposes to rank up these ideas of people thinking that they're going to need a bomb shelter where everyone, I mean, the threat of communism back then was so inflated. It was like what we dealt with COVID in the beginning, when everyone thought you were just going to die. So that's what communism was back then. And there's like this distorted aspect of things where now you have this area where you have people that especially with like communism, would we have gone to war? Would we have been so scared of or brainwashed in the sense to fear communism as much if we understood it or what it actually was? Or was it being manipulated by the media? Or was it being manipulated by the government? So now you have this whole discourse of like fan fiction. I mean, there's speculation that Jack Ruby was a homosexual. I don't know. His roommate, his testimony called him his boyfriend, but apparently he liked women as well too. So then is that fan fiction? Is that conspiracy or is that historical record? We have a document to show it as well too. So then they get into this territory where it's like, I think when we talk about the trend of the 50s and 60s, this peace and love aspect of things, I think when you get to this trend of nihilism, I think that's if you want to spark up an argument to why people should give a shit about the historical record, which I am one of those people. I think people should care about the historical record. I think people should love history. But if you're surprised of why kids don't like it today, I think it's because this age of nihilism, because I think it is that large amount of information out there and then trying to find out what's true. It makes people want to give up before they even begin. And it's like,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. And I think that everything that's going on with social media is a big factor there, because a lot of people think, well, if I don't know what's true, and what's true is important to me, why should I even bother? Because there's this deluge of posts, right? And I don't have the time to sort through them all, so I'm just not going to participate. Um, I have a different view on that though, because my I don't know if you saw the clip last night. I know you're a big fan of the show, the Joe Rogan Experience. He just had Zuckerberg on. So I saw that update on YouTube last night and I thought, wow, okay, I'm going to listen to this clip. And in the clip, Joe was talking to Zuckerberg about how he or Facebook or Meta like decides things are true. And Zuckerberg goes, well, he dishes up some pretty impressive word salad, in my opinion. And then he says, well, if we talk to law enforcement agencies and the FBI and we think that this or this isn't true, then we down rank it in search and it's still there, but it's suppressed, but it's not that suppressed, but I'm not going to tell you how suppressed it is, but it was suppressed, but blah, 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 whatever. And then Joe said, well, if something comes out as being true later that you originally thought, wasn't true, don't you feel bad about that? And he's like, oh, yeah, that sucks. And I mean, there's a lot I could say, even about that short clip, which I won't, because of the way the internet is now. But one of the things that I will say is, at a certain point, especially given that social media is a thing that exists and posts can go viral, whether or not a story is actually true is just one part of the question. If a narrative, if a story gets around the world in 5 minutes and it's ingrained in people's consciousness and it affects the way they think about something, it becomes, it's something you have to reckon with, whether or not it is true. And it's not enough to say, oh, well, that isn't true, so we can ignore it. Now, people say that this is what it means to live in a post-truth world. I think that phrase is really annoying. And I think it also shows a massive lack of knowledge of earlier historical epics. It's not as if, they didn't have rumors and quote unquote misinformation in the ancient world. People absolutely did. But also, a lot of times what we find is there are grains of truth in every believable story, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't be believable. So if a lot of people believe something, especially if something goes viral on social media and it's not force fed by some sort of mainstream media outlet or multinational conglomerate. Um, you we should ask ourselves, hey, why is it that people believe this? And usually, it's because there are things about it that have the ring of truth to them. They think, yeah, maybe my government isn't telling me the truth, or yeah, maybe politicians really are corrupt, or yeah, I bet this guy did this thing, or something like that. And it's in this context, it is in this context, thinking about the Cold War is really important because the Cold War was a massive intelligence operation that was perpetrated on uh, American citizens, right? So people were told all of these stories basically by their government um, as a reason to hate communism and hate the Soviet Union. And this is something I know just a tiny little bit about, is my husband, even though he's a linguist, he started out studying Russian, and he speaks Russian. He studied in Russia many, many years ago. And one of the things that he always says about Russia is that all the stories you've heard about it are probably wrong. Like all the stories that you probably heard about the Soviet Union, are probably wrong. He likes to emphasize to me when things come up in the news, especially now Russia's a sore point in the news again, um, that a lot of the people that he stayed with when he was a student, he'd stay in people's houses. He'd have house house mothers, or host mothers, host fathers, and they would tell him that they missed the Soviet Union. You know, they missed Stalin. And for an American kid, that was just like, wow, how can you say that? Because everything that America says about Russia, because this was, fairly long time ago now. The first time he went to Russia was in the early 2000s. So it was coming off the 90s, right? And in the 90s, everything we heard about Russia in the West was, oh, Russia's great now, Russia's free, Russia's democratic, um, everything in Russia is so much better than it used to be, right? But then he went to Russia, and the people there had lived through this massive economic dislocation, just absolutely insane. That their money disappeared from the banks. They had suddenly they had nothing. They went from living in a system that at least they could understand to living in a winner take all, like wild wild west situation. And they what do most people want? Most people want normal lives. Most people want the stability to know that they'll have money to buy food, and they'll have heat in the winter, especially in a place like Russia, or cold running water in the summer, and things like that, in order that they can sort of spend more time thinking about the things that are personally important to them. And when all that falls apart, a lot of things go wrong. And in the West, we didn't hear about all of this. We just heard, oh yeah, well, there's some economic pains associated with perestroika, or associated with, you know, moving from a command and control economy to a more free market economy. But the real story is very different. And you've got to go and talk to the people that it was affected, who were affected by this. And I think, as much as it may be mind-blowing, and as much as you might, like, for example, from an American perspective, be really shocked to hear someone say, well, I miss Comrade Stalin. Um, we need to take the time to sit down and figure out why someone might say that. instead of just saying, well, I guess that means they're crazy, or I guess that means they're stupid, or I guess that means they're evil, right? Because Stalin was evil. Those are just ways to short circuit thinking about things that happened. And just to bring this full circle, because I'm talking about economics again, when we started out talking this morning, I brought up, you know, economics being a modern conceit. And I think economics is a little bit of a special case in that the modern world really doesn't think that there were economic, like rational thoughts about economics before modern economic theory. And this really isn't true. So a lot of these stories that we tell ourselves about money and why money is valuable, people will come out on the news on all sides of the issue and say, well, we have to live in an economy like this, right? We have to have this kind of currency. We have to have this sort of thing. We have to be concerned with, the stock market line always going up. The line has to go up, right? And it doesn't matter if, you look around your town or your life and all you see is economic devastation. If the line goes up, then everything's great. Um, it's it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And I think with the advent of cryptocurrency and NFTs, like you brought up, people are starting to see for themselves that the money that we use is basically just an agreed upon fiction, right? Governments say, okay, this has value, and so we exchange it for goods and services. But it really only has value because our governments say that it does, and at least in the case of the United States, because of the petrodollar set up with Saudi Arabia, which may be a thing of the past pretty soon. But so people are saying, okay, if money is just something that we agree has value, if we agree that cryptocurrencies have value, if we agree that NFTs have value, why can't we create something new? And I think all the pushback that you see against that is really instructive.
I have a complicated answer to that. I have a complicated answer to a lot of the things you said. Mostly, I think if we tackle the money issue, it went from cash to card pretty quickly. People just got used to using card. Now most places accept card. It's more of a digital dollar rather than accepting the money that we've gone by for so long. My issue with this transition is to make sure that it doesn't become an effective means of more manipulation or control in the hands of the people that hold the power already. And that is with card. I mean, they can lock your bank account. Your card can be easily hacked into from plenty of other people from overseas, whatever you want to say, manipulated in so many sense to where your digital dollar and essentially you just have a plastic card in your pocket and they let you access your money whenever they say that you can access your money. As long as you don't step on, I mean, see, like I said, it's a complicated answer that I have because if you ask me my response on things, I would tell you that I think that if you really have to look at what we would consider valuable as a society, I think both sides of the argument are correct. I just think that we're thinking of it differently. People would hear what you said about your husband's story about, his family missing Russia and say, well, this is just one of those communists or one of these people that were pro communism. I mean, I consider that if you don't listen to somebody's explanation or perspective and consider it as valuable as your own, then there's no point in saying that we're all equal because you don't obviously consider that person equal in a valid argument. Best part I love about conversation is we're just talking. We're going to talk about whatever it is, and necessarily doesn't have to be what you're qualified to speak about. But it's your experience, it's your thoughts, it's the way that you think. To me, that's valuable. To me, that is considered as valuable as speaking to someone that has billions of followers or none at all. I mean, you got to consider it at the same playing field. It's about getting people to want to, I guess, engage in conversation, having these aspects of things to be able to talk about these decisions. If we talk about the complex issue with the idea of communism, man, I could argue from both sides. I think there's a big push, or you could, I guess, throw out plenty of evidence to say that the government of America probably manipulated a lot of things to make Russia weak in a lot of sense, because in an aspect there was a societal structure of fear around that. I think maybe some preconceived notions of fear might be manipulated in a sense for that initial gain. But I also have a lot of documents to say that as much as we can expose American government and say American government does some awful shit, every government does some awful shit. I mean, there's a KGB policy about assassinating Western officials. And sadly, that was in tandem with the American government. So you have this aspect of like, okay, so when we talk about like if I said the United Nations or something like that, one person does something that's seen wrong in the eyes of the majority, I would say. That person's bad and they have to be punished for what they just did. Okay. But what happens if someone did the same thing, but they were more liked by the majority of the people at the United Nations? Then would they be accepted? Probably. It would probably be seen differently than someone who is the least favored in the United Nations doing something that everyone disliked. There'd be different consequences for those too. And I don't accept that. I don't like that. I think there's a lot of you can do it, but the other person can't. People would label this like a race issue. I think it probably does intertwine with that as well too. But I also think it's the value of that person. There's just some people we know, like billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg and others like that, that can get away with things easier than when we can get away with something. But I think it's the idea that we somehow look at them like having all the power and it's they should have less power. And I think we give them that power. There's this like weird double-edged sword where if everyone just stopped using Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg would be nothing. But we don't accept that. Instead, we want to complain on his platform about the issues that his platform has. And it just doesn't make sense. So I'm like I said, my opinions on everything are probably more controversial only because I'm so middle of the road on everything. It's not that I don't have an opinion. It's just that it's very, very difficult to say that your opinion should be more valued than another person's opinion based on the perspective of stuff. I mean, if you ask me my idea of politics, whenever someone says right wing or whenever someone says left wing, I just fucking roll my eyes because it's like you are dismissing the other side. And but the weird part is to me that I guess you're assorting yourself on a side where it's like, hold on. If you're talking about making a rational decision, it shouldn't be on the basis of what your side favors or what the other side opposes. It should be on the basis of what's a good decision. That's logical to me. But to others, they just say, no, that's what this person or that would say. And then that's where I would probably side more with libertarian views. But then at the same time, I don't like being a libertarian because I think the government's needed. I think a lot of this crazy stuff that the CIA does that I love so much is just fascinating to me to find out like drugs and all this is involved. I think it's horrible, but I also get it. There's a large push to understanding research and like let me relate something a piece of history. For the longest time, you know where they would test out drugs and test out experiments on? If I could give you a chance to guess, where would you guess?
Um, you mean which country?
Which just where would you think that the government would test out their drugs or they would test out human experimentation? Where would you just suggest?
I would suggest probably in like inner cities or places where people are poor. I think I've read about that.
That's fair. Yeah, there's examples to that. It links into there's a thing called blockbusting. I don't know if you know what this is, but they would come into neighborhoods and say, "Hey," and this was the time when segregation before all that kind of got into this high peak where everyone was more considered equal, but they had separate water fountains and things of that sort. They would bust into neighborhoods. The government would and say, "Hey, you need to move your house because there's a certain ethnicity moving in the neighborhood and your property value is going to go down." That's what they would say. It's blockbusting. Well, they did the same thing with like heroin. A lot of people fight it's more of a controversial take, but they say that the reason, if you look at like the drug that they tried to kill Castro with, and it's going to take us down a little bit of a rabbit hole. They had poisoned cigars to kill Castro. They had like 693 attempts to it. One of the toxins in those cigars, I looked it up, is called botulinum. And this botulinum type of toxin is the same derivative that's in heroin. So then now you can look at the argument of the reason why we were in Vietnam was for heroin. I mean, that makes a little bit more sense now, but you also start looking at certain poisons that we have used throughout history and they have the same bacterium chemical in it. And then now you look at the area of blockbusting, what I mentioned earlier about certain ethnicities moving in the neighborhood, telling you to move your property value. Imagine you're doing a political campaign or you're trying to get votes or you're trying to keep people from oppressing the government. What would you do? You introduce a hardcore drug into a neighborhood that someone's going to get addicted to it. Now you have family members that are dying and you have people that are less caring about what the policies or politics or the issues going on in their city are, and they're more caring about the fact that they just lost their son to a hardcore drug. It's It's those types of tactics. And I've seen documents on that to back it up. That's horrible shit, but it's real. And that's the thing is like, it's not just us, it's other governments as well, too. I mean, if I asked you the question, where would you think people would experiment on in the government would experiment on people? Mental institutions, hospitals, people where they're already suffering from something. And it sounds crazy, but you mentioned something about like people with disabilities not being given a fair right in history. I think that's right, but I also think we're not doing the same thing now. It's the same issues going on too with like we understand more about mental disabilities, but in the 50s they used to just drop kids off at a mental institute to parents would drop kids off at a mental institution and then not pick them back up, and then the government would do horrible things with these. That's the Edgewood experiments. That's Willowbrook State School, where they were injecting kids with tetanus and all this horrible shit, and just, I mean, piles, hundreds of them in a room naked, and they would spray them with a hose and let them crap on the floor and stuff. Horrible stuff. Dark history, it is. But there's also a change in that when they started to get looked at and more people started coming out with stories of the government experimenting on people in these institutions, where they just slipped it into their policy in the military, that in the military they can experiment on you with LSD and do all these types of things, which have led into projects during the Cold War that Russia was also doing at the same time. And it's the fact that you work for us, you can't really object to it. And it's just the evil doesn't change, it just changes a different face. So you got to look at that. When we talk about a core issue in society, we talk about currency. Okay, money's a problem, the value of things are going down. How are we going to fix that? We're going to switch the currency to a digital dollar. Now that digital dollar might seem as a beneficial thing that's going to restore the currency, but now it's being manipulated more by other people that hold the power to that digital dollar. You see what I'm saying? Like, that's not, it sounds conspiracy when everything I just said, but then when I start laying it out for you, it makes a little bit more sense. It's not really conspiracy, it's a really smart strategy on how to be able to manipulate and make things go your way. So when I go back to the point of the left and the right, the reason why I scoff at both of them is because I don't think they really have any power. I think there's good goals, and there's, depending on which side you prefer, those are laudable goals to go after. But I also think that when you look at the president, you should be looking at someone that just really holds a spot. And I think I would reference that to Kennedy's point when Kennedy took the big debacle for the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs wasn't Kennedy's problem, but he thought as a leader that he should take the responsibility for it. So he did. And that's why he gets blamed for that through history. But if you looked at what the CIA was doing in Cuba before Kennedy even took office, it's an inherited problem that he became responsible for. So then you look at the presidency now. How many people get into office are trying to undo the shit the last president did? That's true. Those are problems that are going to keep them busy for a while. But then you look at the issues of Facebook, you look at the issues of censorship, you look at the issues of information and disinformation. Where does that now get held? It gets held into our social media assets, because now the power has transferred from that political issue to now being a more societal social media issue, which isn't good either, because now you're putting it in the hands of big business. So Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, that clip from Joe Rogan, talked about labeling Hunter Biden's laptop as disinformation because he was given from the government, the FBI, saying that this is Russian disinformation. There's the fear of communism again. They do, they
Yeah,
do, they
yeah.
do manipulate our search. There's
Oh, absolutely.
the top 10 pages on Facebook are all Russian troll farms. I think the first one's My Baby Daddy Ain't Shit with over 3 million likes or something like that. It's crazy. They've definitely infiltrated our social media, and it's fucking easy to manipulate us. That's the funny thing. But you also look at now they're using that as an example of why they need to make a certain action, and you accept it because you don't have all the information of what that fear is. And that's a very dangerous thing. I'm sorry,
Oh,
I
it's
ranted.
it no, it's no, don't apologize. It's totally dangerous. And one of the things that I think ties all this together is the fact that there are people in our government, sort of the permanent government, if you like, the civil service, the people who don't change when the presidents change, what some people call the deep state. Uh, they are still operating on these Cold War era stories. They really are.
I think it's deeper
And
than that, though. I would bring up the argument. I think this stems back to before we even had written down tablets. I think this stems back to a more ancient period. The reason why I say that is if you, damn it, I'm going to mention the man again, but Mike Tyson. whatever you want to say about Mike Tyson being an insane fighter and biting somebody's ear off, that man has a fucking historiography brain when it comes to just looking into weird history shit. And he mentioned about the ancient Egyptians. Every ancient Egyptian hieroglyph you see, they're all really skinny. There were fat Egyptians. They just never wrote them down. They considered them a blemish through history. They considered them these marks that make their society look weak. How many things in Rome and Greek mythology were the same way? Did you pause?
Yeah, I was saying that's correct, except there's one exception that I know of in the history of ancient Egypt to that, right? You say all these ancient Egyptians were statues that we see are skinny and they're idealized.
Unless it's an
You know,
emperor or like some type of king.
you know, especially if it's the pharaoh, right? Except when we get to the pharaoh Akhenaten. And one, I don't know if you know the history of Akhenaten, but he there are some theories that he might have had a disability or something like epilepsy, but he was considered very weak as a child, and he at a certain point had a series of religious experiences where he believed that he had a revelation, basically, that there was one God, the sun god, that he represented in his iconography with a disc called Aten. And so he changed his name to Akhenaten, right, to honor this god that he had this revelation about. And when he became pharaoh, he basically instituted this new religion and tried to overthrow the polytheistic religion of ancient Egypt. Um, he was obviously unsuccessful in this because all of the entrenched powers in the priesthood didn't want to be overthrown for various reasons. And when he died, he was condemned to damnatio memoriae, right? So uh, all of his tablets and statues and artworks were defaced. His name was chiseled out of monuments, right? Because the Egyptian deep state, if you like, they wanted to say, right, okay, we don't want people to remember that this existed. We want to create the idea. We want to write the story that our religion never changed. But while Akhenaten was pharaoh, he not only oversaw this complete religious revolution, but it was also um, it went hand in hand with a revolution in art, and the art became more realistic. And we do have surviving examples of art from that period, and you see fatter statues or more sort of realistic and rounded um, representations of people. So that did happen for one brief moment in ancient Egyptian history.
You know why I'm so obsessed with history? You want the real answer? Someone came to me and told me why is society so fucked up. Pardon my French, but someone came up to me and said society's just what the hell's going on with the world today? Everything's gone to shit. It's what I've always heard. And I start looking through history. I'm like, how do you expect people to make? I mean, how do we look at society and say it's messed up when it's always been messed up? We've just been really good at hiding it for a very long time. I mean, it might be that might be a controversial take, but a lot of people would say like society's messed up today, and I think it's always been messed up. I think when we look at the historical record of thing, I think we have these peaks and we have these lows, and I think there's a lot of people, I would call them woke people, would want to tear up and get the real truth out there, mostly because they've looked into one section and found that side of history that's been blocked or that's been hidden. Things where injustices were. I think that's a valuable cause to fight. But I think it's always been like that. I think we're told the wrong history because the real history is pretty dark. And I think the dark history is what gave us this position that we're at today. So we can't really be a hypocrite and make fun of what that dark history is. But where the logical side of me would come in and be like, you would think that if you're trying to hide this part of something that you did, it probably would make you think twice about doing that. Well, nobody thinks of it like that. Not history doesn't look at it like that. History looks at we had things we had to do because of this and because of that. That's true. I believe both sides of that argument. I believe the side that fights against it and the side that fights for it. But when we get to this place of why do we have a bunch of people that are disorganized with what the world is and trying to figure out what the hell is going on and why does everything suck and life doesn't matter and it's all these political elites that are running everything, I think all those are valid. But I also think there's no difference from today than it was 2,000 years ago. The objects around us have changed, but the structure of how things have been going throughout history, nobody's ever wanted to record the bad shit. You probably have moments in your life you have just forgotten that are the most embarrassing things in your life. And you maybe if you thought hard, you could think and remember what those were. And you'd be like, oh my God, I did do that. But you forgot about it because your brain doesn't want to remember that stuff. There are things that you like, you'll see a meme of someone like, oh, that time in eighth grade, they'll like be laying on their bed and they'll have their hands crossed over their chest or something. It's like, remember that time in eighth grade, right when you're trying to get some sleep? There are moments like that, but those aren't really the big blemishes that your brain wants to forget. There's bigger things in your brain that are trying to hide and really tear things down that can shatter your reality or who you are right now today. So society is only in chaos because it's always been in chaos. And the reason it's always been in chaos is because we've been trying so hard and more probably effort to hide the dark things that we do rather than focus on what we're doing today. You know, there's a real examination through history about like the backside of it, all the historical past. I've done it, looking through the Cold War, looking through all this parts of things. It's fun. For me, it is at least. But there's not a whole lot of looking forward to like how do we make sure we don't make the same mistakes? Well, the answer that we've been going off of for what, 5 years now, 3 years now, has been tearing up that history, making it right. But we're not really making it right. We're forgetting about it. We're losing it. We're destroying it. We're getting rid of pieces of history we don't like. Well, then now you're going to mess up the whole historical record. So I think the dark blemishes of things, like if I was going to be a teacher, I would probably teach kids the real history of things. Like, yeah, this is going to be a dark, but I would come at it with that expertise, or not really that expertise, but that kind of notion, which is there's going to be things in history you don't like, but you can't just close your eyes at things you don't like. You have to understand it, you have to look at it, and you have to look at both sides of that perspective. I think you can value that as well too. I'm pretty sure there's parts of history you probably aren't a fan of, but you know, you understand it just on the basis of what the time period was like. I mean, people getting killed, people with disabilities getting killed. If you were born with a disability, there's like a more likely chance back then that they would just kill you. But
Well, yeah, I mean, it's true. Now, we used to think that that was absolutely always true, and I know some classicists and archaeologists on Twitter are doing research into this topic, disabilities in the ancient world, and they've discovered that there are records of people in ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Greece who clearly lived with disabilities, and so they were allowed to grow up and have lives and do things, but they were usually in the upper classes. So again, we had this idea like, okay, what would happen to you if you were born disabled in the ancient world and you were poor? Well, probably you wouldn't survive. I mean, I think it's a little bit ironic that I'm so interested in the ancient world and have 3 degrees in it, because if my mom and I had been transported back in time, odds are neither one of us would have survived, right? She would probably have died um, when I was born, and then if she had died, obviously I would have too. But there's a lot going on now that you say, okay, things are messed up because they've always been messed up. In a certain sense, that's obviously true. Human nature, doesn't change. People are still motivated by um, irrationality, greed, love, all these things you can't quantify that cause people to just, go off in one direction and not be moved. But at the same time, I do think that the world is radically different and important ways now, for good and ill, because of social media, because of technology. I think there's a degree of centralization in our world that ancient people, even people from a century ago, just couldn't imagine. You brought up the digital dollar and being locked out of your bank account earlier. That kind of stuff just couldn't happen 100 years ago, right? You could have all kinds of whacked out political views. You could want to do all kinds of things, and you'd still have access to your money. You'd still be able to like live your daily life.
Until you said objectionable things, and then the emperor or the king or whoever decided to come down to your house, either take your gold or just slaughter you and your family.
That, but see, the thing is that didn't happen as much as the stories that were told about the
You
past
only need
might.
it to happen once, and then everybody in your civilization is not stay away from saying that or stay away from any of that type of stuff.
Maybe, but
It's like,
okay, if you're
hold on, one person gets banned off social media. That's a bad thing. That person loses that account. That person's going to be messed up. But same people will still say the same thing. And if anything, if their account gets banned, they'll just make another account and say the same thing over and over again. There's no rational fear in that anymore. But back then, people would be hung, people would be killed, executed, whatever, if they said objectionable things, where enough of it caught on to where people said, I can't say this. Content creation is a great example. I couldn't talk about certain COVID stuff because YouTube wouldn't allow it. So you have to make the deciphering choice. If I enter into this topic, can I talk about this and risk not being on YouTube, but then only having it on Spotify, skew the viewership, or I just self censor? And self
right.
censor is a difficult thing because that's an ingrained feature. And then once you start doing that, it's very hard to undo that censorship thing. So it's like a risk analysis. You got to look at decision making throughout history, and decision making throughout history. It might be different because we can talk about social media, but I think the message was still the initially same. People back then didn't know what social media was. They didn't care about social media. But the I agree with you is what I'm saying. When we talk about the idea of communication through social media, it allows us to connect more. That's a positive. That's a great thing.
It's
But
amazing.
the issue with that is, are we communicating? Are more people communicating, or are more people picking sides in favor of the options that they prefer rather than hearing the full discussion? And that's
And
the double-edged sword here.
right. And on that note, I want to bring up, I don't know if you've ever listened to Jimmy Dore, but he's really interesting. And like
You're more
you,
political than I thought.
I have political views just like everybody else. I mean, I love talking about the ancient world, but I obviously have views about our own world. And my husband and I listen to the Jimmy Dore show when we can. And recently he brought up an article from like 10 or 11 years ago. No, probably maybe like 12 years ago. So like 2008 or so. And he was just reading this article, and this article was all about how the CIA was actively using social media to further certain viewpoints. It didn't really specify what those viewpoints were. It was just a bunch of freedom of information requests, and it was basically like, hey, the CIA is all over social media. And looking at that from where we are now really gives you pause, doesn't it? I think a lot of the stuff that's going on now, one of the reasons why it's so toxic is that I don't think that this is all the natural sort of consequences of human nature or people interacting on social media. I think that there is an element where these things are created specifically so that people will, like divide themselves up into camps and have these, like the endless culture war, which is just so tiresome. because all these accounts on social media just endlessly firing back and forth about, oh, these people want to destroy our traditional values. Oh, these people want to, hurt everybody who isn't like them. And you just have these endless back and forth and all of these grifters on both sides saying, oh, you should support me because I'm on your team. You should support me because I support these ideas. When we're at a political and social moment where these sort of team dynamics of left and right or red and blue don't really matter. They they don't matter. There's so much going on now. Um, I think that breaks those ideas of left and right down. And
I agree with you, and I like Jimmy Dore, but I want to also make sure you got to look at other things too. I think Russell Brand's good. I think Jimmy Dore's good. I think Joe Rogan's good. I think Bill Maher's good. I think a bunch of these people are good. See, that's the thing. When you get that little head nod thing, it's because Bill Maher is the one person I gave an example to out of the list I just did that don't probably side on the same political spectrum. I think Joe Rogan's probably a little bit more balanced. I know he says he's more left, but I would consider him more balanced on things. It's just this way that we got to value the way that we like examine things. Like I don't agree with a lot of shit people say, but I like hearing it. I like talking to them about it. I like understanding their perspective on it. I think they're all a lot of those guys I probably wouldn't agree with politically, mostly because whenever someone like I started like I would normally agree, like I agree with your deep state talk. I really do. I think that way too. But then in my head, I start going, yeah, but we can't say that because that sounds nut job. That sounds crazy talking about deep political. And it's like it's not true. There's plenty of evidence to support that the CIA divides up populations using tactics like that. And you could use social media as an example of that too. But I also think that it's not necessarily hard for them to do. And the fact that we keep continuing that spectrum of things. I mean, we know agent provocateurs is a real thing. These are people that are hired by the government to steer up a population and divide amongst them. This is a common example be Black Lives Matter protests. There was a dude with an umbrella pointed at the camera, wasn't supporting Black Lives Matter. He was just walking around with a hammer and hitting store windows in. I mean, what is that? Nobody knows what that is. That's been throughout history. You've had people that were working for the government, FBI informants, CIA informants, doing whatever, stirring up populations. You should look at the list that we did in Cuba. It's nuts what we did over there. But I mean, it's from their point, it's strictly strategic. The fact is that we don't know how to make sure that we stay on target with whatever that we're trying to do. And I think if we look at the idea of social media, I think like I'm probably out on speaking on this only because I've been off social media for a long time. I don't like to use it anymore. And I've insanely gotten happier. Let me tell you that much. Um, but there's a lot of information out there. And the fact that I could say something like, if I said something like the government tried to kill Castro, you wouldn't disagree with me. I could show you the documents that they did. But then if I would have said the government killed Kennedy, people would say that's a conspiracy. And I said, why? When you look at all the individual actors and all the methods they try to kill Castro with, and then you look at the same exact methods that Kennedy is conspiracy, I guess, situated with, they're the same. So we can't believe that we would do it to our own, but we believe we'll do it. It's okay if we do it to somebody else. Like that's the weird part. I think everybody's a hypocrite. I'm a hypocrite. I think everybody is. I think that's important to recognize that. But if you call somebody a hypocrite or you call someone out on their hypocriticism, then they get upset. And it's like, but it's true though. Like it's very hard to strongly be authentic in any aspect of your life. I'm at fault for not being all. I don't know. There's like this conversation. This is what I want to talk about, but I know someone listening is like, why don't they talk about ancient Greece? I don't know. It's the hardest part about not having a script. It just goes off on things. And I think that's what makes it a little bit more real. It also adds in the era of when people have regret because they necessarily say something that they necessarily didn't want to be out there. And that's what I think is an issue. I think you should be more comfortable saying how you feel about things. I think people need to start speaking their mind about things. And that's when you have people on social media. That's what that's there for a lot of people. It's just to say stuff they normally wouldn't say to a person's face. And it's just because all the feelings that they have that they keep bottled up for so damn long. And I think that's an issue in our society. I think that's our biggest problem is we need to somehow accept that. We need to somehow get a way to we can vent that. Like A good example would be male mental health. That wasn't looked on 10 years ago. That wasn't looked on 5 years ago. More men try to kill themselves, or more men are successful at killing themselves than women are, but more women try to attempt it. But it's always been popularized as like you're a guy, dust it, whatever, dust it off, and get back to work if you fall and hit your knee or something like that. I'm glad that we're giving a look at that and we're examining it a little bit deeper, but we also tend to overboard it as well too, where it's like, are you okay? You want to talk about your feeling? No, I just fucking stubbed my toe. Like, move on. Like, there is that. And then there's like, so there's a weird like balance that we need to find. And I think we can start doing that by looking at the aspect of social media. We could use this as a benefit, but you have to accept the risks that also do fall with it. And the biggest part throughout history, at any event in history, is the fact that nobody looks at these unintended consequences. If you make a decision, it could be life or death for something else out there. If you decide that you want to put a pool in your backyard, look at the aspect of you might be killing whatever wildlife is in your backyard, ants, whatever. Now, whatever you consider the value of an ant, to someone else, it's different. To someone else, it means a lot more. So it's just like you got to understand with your morals and values and your convictions and your decisions, your feelings that you feel are entitled. But at the same time, if you go and shout them in somebody's face and expect them to have either the same feelings as you, is whether you attribute them to a team or not. But then when they disagree with you, you consider them an enemy. That's what I want to fix. I don't think I have the ability to do that, but I think, I don't know, coming from a standpoint of someone that hears all sides on everything, I just think that there's a lot more shouting on social media than there is on, and that just might be my news feed. Someone else could just strictly stick to puppy videos or something like that and have a completely positive interaction. I don't disagree with that at all either. But we definitely have like a really weird world right now where it's not just people can blame the government. I will too, but I also blame ourselves. And if you can't, if you rather blame the government than take fault for things that you also do wrong, then that's an issue. And I think you need to look at it like that way too. And that's the only way you can get agreements done. And that's the only way you can really get progress moving forward. I might be wrong. Like I said, I have a lot of controversial takes on a lot of things, only because I've talked to so many people that have completely one side and then completely another side. And then sometimes I'm a middle roader on everything. If you ask me to protest, I'm going to tell you I'm going to sit down for a minute and catch my breath. Mostly because there's no, I don't know. I don't see it. I guess I see it helping in some aspects, but I think you need an overall way of how you value people. And I think the best thing you can do is probably value someone else's opinion the same as your own. There's a lot like, even if you don't agree with me, if you told me, let me make a correction for you, that's fine. Because then you're saying, let me make a correction for you. You're not saying I'm an idiot and I'm, not getting it. And, I'm wrong about everything. Wrong, wrong. It's like, no, you're just saying, let me help you show you something else that might add to your knowledge bank. And then bam, then opinion might change, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I do. I actively try to consume all different kinds of media. So I'm aware of that. I mean, I think we should, all of us, try to be more aware of that, like you've been saying. I think that the most important thing that we can recognize, and I have to remind myself of this like daily, sometimes multiple times a day based on what my newsfeed says, is that ordinary people actually do have a lot of power. And if we had a massive boycott of something or a massive strike, for example, we could really change things.
I agree. I just think you shouldn't have to boycott, though. That's the thing. The fact that people feel like they need to or they feel like they have to means there's a problem. And the
I
fact
think a
that
lot
there
of
is a,
things are out of balance.
yeah. Well, I mean, a lot of people, man. It's hard to govern a place correctly. I think the fact that we've managed to make it this far along with all the problems that we've had, I mean, it could have always have been worse. You look at like World War, that fear that's out there. I mean, I would hate to be a person that just works on nuclear disarmament or nuclear policies. I've talked to those folks and they just throw stuff at you that would make you want to sit in a room and like cry on the floor because like the stuff that, oh, there's over more nukes than we can count out there. There's more weapon systems out there that we can't even counteract. And if one person launched a missile, it's just mutually assured destruction. We just destroy them back. You're like, what? Like those people don't even think about that. And then you talk to like a biologist, or you talk to someone who studies like the human body. The fact that our lungs can even get up with all these other, and then you start rattling off a list of things where it's like, holy shit, like worst thing I was complaining about today was that my 2 for $5 special at the store was off. So, and I might not have dinner tonight. So it's like, that's my complaint. But then, you start realizing there's other aspects of stuff. So I think when you look at the amount of information, you're accepted to a certain amount that you can take on, but you're also not responsible for the things that you don't know. So like, that's how I look at it. Like there's a lot of things I don't know. I'm the first to tell you I don't know anything, but I am trying. And I think that's a lot that people, should take from. I think you are open to as many minds as I'm possibly open to. You definitely have certain people that you would probably prefer to talk to rather than having people like there's some people I can't talk to. Like I can't talk to anybody about Native American culture without it turning into like a woke competition where people are like, and it's the white man's fault. I'm like, fuck. Like as soon as that comes in, I'm like, damn it, I'm already on the wrong side. But it just gets to this point where you got to laugh, you got to learn, you got to accept, you got to have conversations, you got to do a bunch of stuff. I mean, is there one thing out there that you've learned that you just can't accept?
Is there one thing I've learned that I can't you mean like as a historical fact?
Let's do a historical answer, and then let's do a personal answer.
You can't accept in the sense that I just don't want to believe it's true.
Or you reject, I would say. But now I'm curious, what do you think is not that you don't want to accept that is true? I don't think we landed on the
Um,
moon.
you don't?
At least when
My
we
dad
said we
my
did.
dad doesn't either.
Oh, me and your dad would have a great conversation.
I think you really would.
Send him
He
my email.
he's gone through I mean, he's a baby boomer, right? So he's gone through this process, and I think it really started with the JFK assassination
It did for most people.
of JFK and Vietnam, and he's done some reading about it, probably not as much as you have, but I think with him, there were certain underpinnings of his understanding of the world when he was young. And as those sort of unraveled, he started questioning things to a degree that I don't know that I necessarily would, but I can see certainly from a personal perspective why he's doing it. Because he's like, well, if the story of my reality that I accepted when I was young was totally fake, what else is fake?
Well, that's where you get into the part where you end up rejecting everything that's out there as it's all lies. And that's very dangerous too. I fell into a rabbit hole with that too, on some aspects of things.
I don't think he's all the way at that level, but I think that kind of feeling is what motivates his, rejection of like the moon landing, for example.
You
I
don't
haven't
you
really
don't
looked
agree?
into it.
You don't agree?
I'm not sure. I want to sit out on that one.
Let
I
me clarify so I don't come off like an idiot.
Okay.
I already come off like an idiot on a lot of other things. I don't need another thing. What I think is that if you look at the aspect of morale during the space race, there was a lot of things where it was like, if we don't make it to the moon first, then we're going to lose our people's faith in us in general. And if you look at the aspect of what the government and what lengths they'll do to make sure that their value and security in them from the public, you start to rationalize it a little bit better. I think we landed there. I just don't think it happened when we said it did. I think it happened later. And I think that's fine. But I also get into this aspect. I think what we needed was a win. And that was our win. And it was Russia cannot beat us there. And when you enter this mentality of like, there's no exceptions, it's just this. I'm not talking about the idea of the moon landing being fake. I'm talking about when our goal has to be it has to be completed before another person, and there's no exceptions, no losses that's going to happen here. You start entering territory where people will do whatever they want to make sure that they win. lawyer trials are the best one. So many lawyer cases, people will blend. One of the biggest ones in the JFK assassination, Vincent Bugliosi. You know who he is?
No.
He wrote a book countering all the critics of the Warren Commission, but he was also the prosecutor for Charles Manson.
Oh, right.
So Tom O'Neill wrote a book about him and had him interviewed, and the guy was suing him before he died of cancer. But what he did was he manipulated the witnesses. He refused to look in and do the right thing of actually looking at the evidence. But his main mission was Manson did it, and this is what's going to happen. And that's why people have problems with like the Warren Commission, because it was Oswald did it, and we're going to show you how, rather than looking at it as a blank field and who the overall mission should be investigating whatever who killed the president. It was just this person did it, and we're going to show you how. And Vincent Bugliosi, a lot of stuff came out about him. He had a love child with this milkman. He said the milkman was the father of his kids. It's not true. He was like mentally wrong throughout his life, and he lied. He was this giant lawyer that everyone respected. And then Tom O'Neill gets all these Freedom of Information Acts out about him. It turns out he was a horrible guy. He beat a woman he got pregnant because she refused to get an abortion, like beat her, made her sign a confession and sign all these things so he couldn't be liable. Then he called it a political scandal. Like, that's dark, crazy stuff. But that's a part of history too. You got to look at the fact of like how many people love that guy and then find out the bad about it, but they won't accept the bad. Then it's like, okay, now what are we doing? I forgot how we got on Vincent Bugliosi, but it's people doing things like a lawyer trial that aren't right. That they're manipulating evidence. It's Innocence Project is big on that, but they want to win. And it's the way we look at things in society. It's not seen as getting the information out there. It's seen as a win or a loss. When you get into an argument with someone, are you thinking like, I just want to know what's right, or are you thinking I want to make sure I'm not looking like an idiot, and then you just start arguing? You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the social media algorithms are designed specifically to get people to that win or lose zero sum argumentative mindset. Like, I think I've told you this story before, but I'll tell it again. Back during the Euro crisis in Greece, um, I I spent a lot of time in Greece. My husband and I did during my PhD. So I had very specific political views on that, even though I'm not Greek, um, and I don't live in Greece. I spent a lot of time there. I could see how the crisis was affecting people. Um, and I was also a more regular Facebook user back then. And there were multiple times I remember logging into Facebook and seeing on my home screen comments that people who weren't even my direct friends, people who were like friends of friends, people I didn't know and didn't normally talk to on Facebook, would post about the Greek crisis, and they'd post things that I really disagreed with. And Facebook would put them at the top of my feed. And
They're trying to piss you off. That's why.
they were absolutely trying to piss me off.
100%.
And at the first time this happened to me, I just went, wow, this guy is totally wrong about this. And the second time it happened, I looked over at my husband and I'm like, hey Tom, who is this guy? And he's like, well, that guy is my Facebook friend, but I don't think he's your Facebook friend, and I don't think you've ever corresponded with him. And I said, well, no, I haven't. And he's like, Facebook is showing me this. And he's like, oh, yeah, okay. And ever after that, I became a much more like aware consumer of my social media. I don't use Facebook as much anymore, but I'm still on other social media, mainly Twitter and Instagram. But the algorithm does do that on purpose.
I definitely think that's true. I definitely think it's much. I mean, that's why they did a Facebook study. I think I forgot who told me that, but they added that dislike feature or that mad feature on the Facebook posts because they realized it would get more attention if people could put an angry face at someone else's comment and post. And it only creates up, people getting mad about stuff even more.
Yeah, I think what makes the issue even more complicated is that there are a lot of things to be mad about. And at least in American culture, it's generally kind of unacceptable to have negative feelings or views. When people just say, "Oh, hi, how are you doing?" The impetus in our culture is to be like, "Oh yeah, I'm great," or "I'm doing okay," or "I'm fine." People don't really respond to that with, "I'm bad," you know? And if you do, like, it becomes this big thing, like you were saying about male mental health. We should talk about things that are difficult, and people should feel like they can say, "Hey, I'm not doing well," and that should be okay. But at the same time, if you do that, people tend to want to, "Oh, well, how are you feeling?" Blah blah blah, and maybe go too far into it, or further into it than a lot of people would like. But in terms of mental health, when you were talking about that, I thought of something. My parents were they became parents when they were a bit older, so they were in their 30s, and then their parents also became parents when they were older, so in their late 30s as well. So my family background is a little bit like, for my husband, for example, it's a whole generation off his family. And both my grandparents and my parents have stories of just totally normalized, absolutely insane alcoholism.
Man, that's all I could do back
Like,
then was
oh
drink.
yeah. Well, like people going out and having
Wait,
4 martinis at
I
lunch.
got I got another one for you. Do you know the government poisoned people during the prohibition? They poisoned alcohol.
No, I did not know that, but I
Yeah,
believe it.
during the prohibition, the government was poisoning people's alcohol. Because if you were drinking that alcohol and you got sick from it, you weren't going to tell anybody because you weren't illegally allowed to drink it. So it was a way to stop people from drinking and really enforcing it. But they just thought, oh, add something onto that because we know people are going to break the law. So why don't we poison it? That means you can get away with poisoning people.
Wow.
I mean, my grandma, I think the reason why I'm also really interested in the Kennedy assassination is she dated one of the Secret Service members. Um, and she said he was a bad guy. But she was really fascinated with the assassination too. But I mean, her era, like when I talked to her about things, she was always giving me crap on something. She goes, "A woman should never have to work. A woman should be strictly for the house." That's her words, not mine. But that was the era she grew in, where she would stay all day at home, cleaning or doing whatever, and drinking martinis, and she fucking loved it. It's that's there's a different time period. I think that's what gets me really the most about history is that like there's just these large gaps of change where it's like so fascinating to try and understand that perspective from the perspective we have today. Where it's like put that in like I wish we could create a simulation and be able to hop back in that. Like what was it like in the ancient Greek days? Sword battling. I would die. I wouldn't have made it either. I have ADHD. I would have died so quick. I would have been interested in too much. He drowned. What do you mean he drowned? He can't even swim. Yeah, he was interested. It's like, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it all depends on the context in which we might have been. And I I mean, ever since I started reading about ancient history, I've always wondered what it would have been like to live back then, and just see all these monuments painted in color, and just experience a polytheistic culture. Because we ultimately, fundamentally, we can't understand what that's like. um, and I don't know that just experiencing it would lead to some deeper understanding, but I think it would help. And you're right. I think one of the things that's so disorienting about modern times is that we have these artificial forces that are trying to manipulate our social dialogue, and they're trying to just speed us on this path. We had this idea that, oh, well, history is a story of progress. Now, personally, I disagree with that, but that was a story that was told to generations of Americans, and it was something that certainly my grandparents believed. I mean, they were politically progressive. they also believed that there was necessarily a progression, in history, going from things that were worse to things that were better. But of course, in their lifetime, they were both born in 1910. They saw massive advancements in medicine, technology, communication, um, just so many aspects of daily life that I think it was reasonable for them to see history in a way as progress, right? Because they had seen so much of that progress. But I think with everything that's going on in the world now, we have, you know, economic crises, war, um, life expectancies are dropping for Americans, especially younger Americans. Um,
Well,
things are
would you blame society today, or would you blame the media? I blame the media for a lot of that. Like the reason why we're talking about economic crisis, the reason that we're talking about, I knew about our economic situation long before the media started reporting on gas price issues. I started noticing that increase. I think the only reason you're hearing about debt now is because it's publicized everywhere. But like, does anybody read any of these fucking bills that anybody passes? No, there's so much stuff that gets
I
passed.
don't think they can.
That's the thing. There you go. So it's like when we look at the media's responsibility and things, I mean, the media is going to report on things, but how come nobody? And I just saw this recently was CBS reported the number of opioid deaths that were happening, but they blamed Walmart and other organizations for doing that. They never touched big pharma. That's an issue. There was over 100,000 people from the age of 19 to 49 that died last year alone of opioid overdoses, and no media is reporting on that. So I mean, there like I started noticing things like there are things that I thought were just like, why? How come this isn't being told? Well, in their groups they are, but it's not being publicized. And if you start thinking that the only issues that if you look at the issues that we talk about today, like society talks about, they're issues that are reported on the media. Well, so it doesn't mean that you trust the media, but are they enlightening you to a problem or just choosing what problem they want to show you? I mean, there's a shit ton of other problems out there. Homelessness, that didn't just go away. There are people that are still homeless out there, but some people are not fucking reporting about it. Like that's what gets me is like, holy, I didn't realize how important it was. Versus like, where do you go for your information? And people would hold me responsible. They go, "You're a podcaster. You should be liable for the things that you say." I fucking hope not. Good God. I say some smart stuff sometimes, but most of the time I'm just having conversations and having fun and trying to learn from people's perspectives. But media outlets, man, they get sued. They just call themselves entertainment, same as WWE, and walk away. That's nuts.
It is nuts, and I think this is one thing that I really like about Russell Brand and his take on his platform is like, I he did a video recently where he was talking about Amazon testing this hand scanning technology, you know, where you can link a credit or a debit card to your handprint,
It's a wave
and
of the
then
future. It's
you
literally
can
you
yeah,
you wave.
right. And then he started looking at these different local news clips that have been sourced for him, by his team. And there was this one news anchor, and she goes, "Well, as a mom, I really appreciate it because, sometimes my hands are full." And then he just looks at the camera and he goes, "What do you mean as a mom? You're the news. I want you to talk to me as the news." I mean, okay, you have a personal perspective. I have a personal perspective. We're all people. But what do you mean coming here on the news and saying, "Well, as a mom?" And he turned it into this whole joke. But it's true. You know, it, they're they're not behaving the way media should.
The way
You
I
know.
watch my news is I like to watch it at 2 o'clock in the morning when it's just like dumb stories or dumb things. And then I like to look at the actual news on my phone from what they were going to be reporting on later. And just looking at like, okay, so you got this side of it where they feel like they can't give you the same news that's going to be reported later at 2 o'clock in the morning. So then you consider what's valuable. If whatever they're reporting at 2 o'clock in the morning, none of them are talking about gun deaths, none of them are talking about all this stuff. We consider that valuable, but also they choose a certain time to show a lot of that stuff. They can just rehash the same thing. That's what they do all day. but they choose at these times in the middle of the night not to rehash it, to make it something different, to make boring stories because the viewership will drop around the middle of the night. So then you start going, okay, so do you care about how many people are watching to view your message, or do you actually care about the message? And then you start looking at, okay, so is this story actually, something that they care about, or is it just something to get us pissed off? Hmm? Huh? Huh? You know what I'm saying?
Something to drive ratings up. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, and I think the 24-hour news cycle has just done so much violence to everything, you know. And my husband likes to watch like clips of old media, like old commercials and old news clips and old local news clips and from stations that are defunct now, as media has become more centralized. And a lot of it is nostalgia. But I mean, some of it is, I think he just wants to remind himself what the world used to be like. And I remember a couple weeks ago he was playing a video from a local news station in Alabama, and it was the very end of the broadcast. Like the whole station was going off the air for the night. They were like, okay, well, that's the end of the news, and this concludes the end of our broadcast day, and good night, everyone. And they played the theme music and went off the air. And that reminded me that, that's the way it used to be. I mean, my dad had a TV at home growing up. My grandfather was really into technology, so he got a TV. And there were 3 channels, and there was a schedule, and at a certain point at night, there was nothing on TV. And I mean, now it's just insane the amount of just interference that we get, just constant. I mean, if you have insomnia or you're just up late at night, you can pick up your phone or go on the computer and you just get this constant barrage of media, and it's not healthy. I don't think that we were meant to deal with just that much input all the time.
It's probably not. It's probably created a lot of insomnia. Talk to some sleep experts that talk about that, but I don't know. Did you hear about the story about the radio station where the people knew it was their last day? They were going to be fired, so they just kept playing "Killing in the Name of," or the radio station was closing down. I think they had a month left, and every day now they've been playing like "Killing in the Name of" by Rage Against the Machine.
No, I did not hear about that,
And
but
people
that's
would
epic.
call in and be like, "You've played the same song again," and then they would be like, "Sorry, we'll try and work on that," and they'll play Rage Against the Machine again. And then they'd be like, "Can I hear Killing in the Name of?" And the guy would be like, "Oh, I'll see if we have that in our records. I might have to dust it out of the back." And they play Killing in the Name of again. I mean, that to me is funny. I like that type of stuff where it's like, I mean, you don't, I think what gets a lot of people interested in people that spark up controversy and spark up all these things is because they're different than this. Look like they're trying to fight the system. And I think there's a large push for that because people don't necessarily like the system, but also people choose what the things you say, whether that affects the system that they want to affect change. You know what I mean? Like people will say that they like Trump because he stirs up the system, but then people will say I hate Trump because he's an idiot and he's all these types of things. I mean, there's overall, like when you look at the system, what do you choose that has issues with it, and what do you choose not that doesn't have issues with it? I mean, everyone's got a problem with something about the system, and I think the fact that I like this system, I just think there needs to be easier workarounds for things as well too. There's not a whole lot of like medical issues that are going on with those types of things. They see a piece of paper, they stamp yes or no on it, and then you get a medication that's for you. But then you wait months for that stamp of approval. And if you get accepted or not is very, very slim. That's an issue. But I mean, you only care about the problems that affect you or you've experienced. So you got to know about how many experiences do you need to understand. And then you get into a whole list of shit. So it's
Well,
interesting.
yeah, I think that's a big issue. You only really care and you're only really invested in the things that affect you. And I think one of the big problems that we have right now in the West is that in general, and certainly in America, but I would say also to some extent in the UK, the people who are in government are just have no experience of or no investment in major problems that affect the lives of a great deal of people. And our government is just so old. Most people in the government are just so old. Like when we had hearings about the activities of social media companies, and Zuckerberg went to DC, and some congressman asked him about Twitter, and he just laughed it off because he doesn't run Twitter, he doesn't own Twitter, and that, like, anybody in our generation or younger would have known that, but he didn't know it and he didn't care. And you watch those hearings and you're like, well, our government is a joke, because all these people are I mean, honestly, most of them are well beyond any kind of retirement age and should probably have retired many years ago. But even if you think they should still be working, they have no conception of how these things affect people's lives. Like, that's what bothers me about the whole student loan cancellation debate. You get all these people in the government who are baby boomers or older and lived in a world where they could get a university level education for free. My parents are from California. They went to Berkeley High School. They graduated in 1970 from Berkeley High School. And at that time, there was a policy that if when you graduated you had gotten on the honor roll for a certain number of semesters, I don't know if it was your entire senior year, I think that was it, or you had a certain class rank, basically, and you applied to UC Berkeley, you were guaranteed a place. Guaranteed. And it was free. It was free for residents. So both of my parents could have gone to UC Berkeley for free. And I asked them about that once. They were like, oh, yeah, well, I guess that's true, but it would have been totally lame, and only losers stayed at home for college. And we wanted to go. I mean, and my dad was like, oh, your grandfather wanted me to go back east because he said the best education was back east. And so, I went back east. And my mom was like, yeah, well, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I just wanted to get out of Berkeley. And so I went to college with my best friend, blah blah blah, and we both went out of state, blah blah blah, because we didn't want to be these losers who stayed at home. Meanwhile, I'm their millennial child being crushed by student debt. I'm just sitting there like, what? You're framing this whole story like, oh, we don't want to be losers, so we want to go to private colleges out of state. So that means that your parents, my grandparents, could afford that. And they were not rich people, they had working class,
How many people throughout
lower middle
history?
class jobs.
How many people throughout history won't do something all because they're afraid of how people will view them? How many?
Exactly.
So
And to this day, I cannot have a conversation with my parents about that, because when I try to, they just revert back to this mindset of, being in high school. And they think, well, we didn't want to do things that only losers would do. Well, of course we could have gone to UC Berkeley, but we didn't want to do that because that was just given to us. We wanted to do something special,
it's
something
like
different.
it's like why I
Meanwhile,
tell. I was gonna say it's like why I don't tell people I do a podcast. Like I work with people, and I'm just like, I don't even mention it because you mention it, people are like, oh, cool. It's like, yeah, that's it. But then like you could say all the guests you've had on or something like that and name drop a bunch, but then people would then take you seriously. Where it's like everyone has a fucking podcast, man. I like it though. There's a lot of content out there.
yeah, no, I get your point. And I guess my point is, I don't see anyone on either side, or any side of the political spectrum in this country talking about, the day-to-day effects of student debt on people.
I think teachers are posting a lot about it, but
Yeah, they are. No, people are posting on social media, and I follow a lot of these accounts, and once or twice I tweet out my own experiences, but nobody who is in the government is making proposals is really affected by this. And so then we get this debate of, oh, well, it's just a handout. Yeah, the government hands out all kinds of things to people. All those bogus PPP loans that were handed out to, people who are online content creators who realistically were not affected by the COVID lockdowns, right? They worked online before it was the thing you had to do.
You know I don't get paid for this, right?
Oh yeah, I know you just do this for the joy
Jesus.
of it.
I wish I made fucking money off this thing. Good God. I had a job. I was suffering during COVID. I didn't get the payment benefits until 6 months in.
Oh, jeez.
So I was like, my bank account was getting drained like a son of a gun. And then it helped when it got there. But it's like, that's what I tell people. I was like, don't forget that pain you went through. Like a lot of people just moved on. And then it was like, it was all cleared. I was like, don't forget that pain.
Well,
Just
but
know.
it's just like what you said earlier when you were saying, well, your brain doesn't want to remember like the most unpleasant things, the most difficult things. Your brain's like, okay, let's move on, you know.
I meant like seeing a cousin naked at a birthday party or
Oh,
something.
wow.
Like
But
dumb
I
shit.
but I th but I think I think it's true for more serious stuff too, and things that were major stressors. Your brain's like, okay, you don't need to deal with that level of stress right now, but we need to be aware of that because it affects our perception of reality. Like COVID was really hard for my family because my dad runs a small hotel in Hawaii, and they couldn't have any guests. And it's still kind of touch and go in Hawaii because of different COVID regulations that I think are still in place. I don't know. They had lockdown level regulations for a lot
Let's not
longer.
get into all that. I don't want YouTube taking it down. Tired of them.
Yeah.
They
Well,
adjusted. They
all I'm
adjusted
saying
some things.
is there's all this debate now about PPP money and whether people who got it were justified in getting it or not. And I know that when my dad applied for it on behalf of his business, it was something that they really needed because they couldn't do business at
Well,
all.
look at what they do with people with disabilities. They make you sign a thing every year and go to something to make sure you actually still have a disability. Like the dude's legs blown
Yeah.
off. It didn't just grow back in a year.
No, legs cannot grow back.
They don't want to
Most
give you money. That's
No,
fine.
the government does not want to help us. Does
No,
not want to help
good.
average citizens.
So what? Who needs them? We don't need them. Anarchy.
Well, I mean,
Destroy it all. No, I'm kidding.
Brand is
Sell
what an
drugs. No,
anarcho
I'm kidding. I'm
an
kidding.
anarcho-syndicalist, right? I I think when I did my master's, I was in Oxford. I went to University College Oxford, and when I was a visiting student there, and that later when I was a master's student, the master of the college, who was sort of like the ceremonial head of the college, was uh, someone named Lord Butler, Lord Robin Butler, and he was a career civil servant in the UK, worked under many prime ministers. His last prime minister was Thatcher, I think, by the time Major was in power. I mean, he might. No, that's
What's the point of the story?
the point of the story is in the UK, as a response to the Iraq War and the whole debate about WMDs in Iraq, they undertook a report. They were like, okay, we're going to try to research this and get to the bottom of this story. And they wanted to do their own report separate from the Americans. This was called the Butler Report. Lord Butler was actually in charge of it. And he didn't really talk a lot about it per se to us, but all of the comments that he ever made about political issues or like how to resolve governmental issues always came back to devolution of powers. So he was convinced that power was too centralized everywhere you looked, and that the best approach would be to have smaller communities making decisions for themselves. And I think that that was his reaction to uncovering a lot of things um, in the course of doing the Butler report. And of course, the conclusion to the report was there were no WMDs in Iraq. And for a long time, our government, um, said that that was wrong until they stopped saying that it was wrong and admitted that it was right. And so I think maybe that's the way forward, like Brand says, we have to create smaller communities and just try to sort ourselves out in smaller groups. That doesn't mean we can't exist in large countries, but it would be a way forward because right now a lot of people are clearly very left out of any kind of system that exists.
There's a lot of people. I mean, the ancient times, as much as we could say disease and all this was horrible, and we have so much better stuff now when it comes to medical, but the smaller community aspects of knowing your neighbor is vitally important to a growing society or just a society in general. I think we see that now with the amount it's easy just to park your car, run inside your house, and watch Netflix all day and never have to talk to your neighbor at all. I do it all the time. But I mean, I don't know. We'll figure it out, I guess. We've been talking for almost 2.5 hours. So
Yeah, I just noticed.
yeah.
Gosh.
Do you have a place you want to promote any of your links, your poetry page, your cats page, anything?
Um, well, I am on Twitter at Dr. VH Smitherman. I on Twitter I mostly retweet ancient history stuff, also Arabic poetry stuff. My husband and I have been teaching uh, Arabic courses, classical Arabic courses. We're on a break now, but if that's something that's interesting to you, follow along and we'll announce when we're going to start up again. My poetry page on Instagram is Dr. Valerie is in, and I have another page that's just all about my cats and how cats are great, and that's the self-care cats. And I basically do that because it's sort of like a break from social media for me and just something that's entirely wholesome.
Well, I'm going to link it in the show.
Thank
Um,
you.
Thanks everybody for listening to this episode about the blank. Stay tuned for next episode.